Some places are not abandoned. They are waiting for someone who can finally hear them. And Ethan Cole felt that the moment his truck rolled to a stop in front of the ruined hotel at the edge of Blackridge Valley, where the wind moved slower, heavier, as if it carried memories no one had touched in decades. The building stood 3 stories tall, its wooden frame warped and gray, windows dark like hollow eyes. A rusted sign creaking above the entrance that hadn't welcomed a guest in over 40 years, yet something about it refused to feel empty. Ethan stepped out, boots crunching over gravel, his breath rising in the cold morning air, while beside him Ranger, his 6-year-old German shepherd, remained unusually still, ears high, body tense, not with fear, but with focus, the kind of focus Ethan had learned to trust more than his own instincts. Ethan was 40, broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked with early gray, his face marked by quiet years that had taken more than they had given back. And he hadn't come here chasing profit. Not really. Because no one buys a collapsing hotel for $12,000 expecting a future. But something in him had gone still when he first saw the listing, like a voice too quiet to hear, but too strong to ignore. The front door resisted when he pushed it open, wood grinding against warped hinges before finally giving way with a low groan that echoed deeper than it should have, as if the sound traveled somewhere beneath the floorboards instead of through the empty halls. Inside, the air carried the scent of dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic, a smell that lingered just beyond recognition, and light slipped through broken windows and thin pale beams, cutting across the lobby where furniture sat draped in gray sheets like forgotten memories waiting to be uncovered. Ranger moved first, paws silent against the floor, his nose lifting, turning slightly as if tracking something no human could sense, and then he stopped. Not near the door, not near the staircase, but near the center of the lobby where the floor looked no different from anywhere else. Ethan watched him, saying nothing, because Ranger did not react without reason, not after everything they had been through together. The dog lowered his head, ears twitching, and a low sound rolled from his chest, not a growl of warning but something deeper, older, like recognition, and Ethan felt it then, a faint vibration under his boots. So subtle, he almost dismissed it, but it came again, steady, measured, like a pulse rising from somewhere far below the surface. He didn't move at first, just stood there listening, counting without realizing he was counting. The way he used to when silence meant something was about to change. 27 seconds passed, then another pulse, and Ranger pressed one paw firmly against the floor as if marking the spot. Ethan exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing. Because buildings don't breathe, not like that, not in patterns, not with intent, yet the rhythm continued, quiet but undeniable, and for the first time since he arrived, he realized he hadn't bought a ruin at all. He had stepped into something that had been waiting. Long before he ever showed up, something that had already begun to notice him. Ethan did not move right away because experience had taught him that the smallest signals often carried the largest consequences. And as the second pulse faded beneath his boots, he slowly crouched down, pressing his gloved hand against the worn wooden floor where Ranger stood frozen. The surface felt cold, but not still. There was a faint tremor moving through it, steady and deliberate, like something deep below was marking time in a language he did not yet understand. Ranger shifted his weight, letting out a soft breath, then tapped the same spot twice with his paw. A behavior Ethan had seen only in the field when the dog was certain, not guessing, not reacting, but knowing. Ethan leaned closer, listening, the hotel around him settling into an unnatural quiet. No wind slipping through the broken windows, no creak from the old beams, just that distant rhythm repeating again after 27 seconds, precise enough to unsettle him. He straightened slowly and scanned the lobby, eyes tracing the layout, the staircase to his left, the front desk ahead, the faded rug beneath his feet that looked like it had not been moved in decades. Something about it felt wrong now, not visibly, but in the way it sat too perfectly in place, as if it had been left exactly where it needed to be. Ranger circled once, then lowered his nose to the edge of the rug and nudged it forward slightly before stepping back and watching Ethan. Waiting. Ethan exhaled through his nose, then reached down and pulled the rug aside, revealing wooden planks beneath, darker than the rest of the floor, worn differently, as though they had been disturbed at some point long ago and then carefully reset. He ran his fingers along the seams, feeling for any inconsistency, any shift, but the boards held firm. Another pulse came, stronger this time, just enough to send a faint vibration up through his palm, and Ranger responded immediately, ears snapping forward, body tightening again. Ethan leaned back on his heels, thinking, not rushing, because whatever this was, it had been hidden for years without being found, which meant it was not going to reveal itself easily. He stood and walked the perimeter of the lobby, studying the walls, the ceiling, the structure, looking for anything that might connect to the rhythm below, any sign of mechanical origin, but nothing matched. Nothing explained the precision of what he felt. When he returned to the center, Ranger was still there, unmoving, eyes locked on the same spot, refusing to be distracted. And that alone told Ethan more than any visible clue could. He crouched again, and pressed harder this time, applying weight, testing the floor as if it might respond to pressure. And for a moment nothing happened, just silence stretching thin, until a faint sound reached him, not from above or around, but from beneath, a soft metallic click, distant and muted, like a lock shifting somewhere deep below the surface. Ethan froze, his breath held without realizing it, and Ranger let out a low, steady hum, not alarmed, not afraid, but alert in a way that suggested something had just changed. Ethan slowly lifted his hand and waited, counting again without meaning to, and when the next 27 seconds passed, the pulse returned, but this time it felt different, slightly closer, slightly stronger, as if whatever had been hidden below had just become aware that it was no longer alone. The air in the lobby seemed to grow heavier after that subtle click, as if the building itself had shifted its attention, and Ethan remained perfectly still, listening with a focus that reached beyond sound, while Ranger slowly lowered his body closer to the floor, ears angled forward, tracking something that neither light nor movement could reveal. The next pulse came, and this time it carried a faint echo, not just a vibration but a distant resonance, like metal brushing against metal, somewhere deep below the wood, and Ethan felt it travel through his fingertips and into his chest, steady and deliberate, impossible to ignore. He glanced toward the staircase, half expecting the sound to lead upward, but Ranger did not move, did not even glance away, which told him everything he needed to know. Whatever this was, it was beneath them, not above. Ethan stood and walked slowly to the front desk, his boots making soft contact with the floor, each step measured, careful not to disturb whatever fragile pattern had begun to reveal itself, and he reached behind the counter, scanning drawers that had not been opened in years, dust coating every surface in a fine gray layer that shifted with each movement. Inside the third drawer, beneath a stack of yellowed papers and a cracked leather ledger, his fingers brushed against something smooth and cold, and when he pulled it free, he found a small brass key, heavier than it should have been, its surface worn but not rusted, as if it had been handled more recently than anything else in the building. Ethan turned it in his hand, studying its shape, noting that it did not match any of the visible locks he had seen so far, and behind him, Ranger let out a quiet breath, the kind he made when something finally aligned. Ethan stepped back into the center of the lobby, holding the key loosely at his side, and as the next 27 seconds passed, he felt the pulse return again, stronger now, more defined, and this time, the faint metallic sound followed immediately after, sharper, closer, like a mechanism adjusting itself in response to something unseen. Ranger rose to his feet and took a single step backward, then another, not retreating but repositioning, guiding Ethan without looking at him, until he stood just a few feet away from the original spot beneath the rug. Ethan watched the movement carefully, understanding that the dog was not abandoning the first location but expanding it, as if the center point was only part of a larger design. He stepped forward, aligning himself where Ranger had paused. And the moment his weight settled, the floor beneath him responded, not with a visible shift but with a subtle change in tension, like a surface that was no longer entirely fixed. Ethan's breath slowed as he crouched again, placing the brass key against the wood, not knowing why, only following the quiet instinct that had brought him here in the first place. And for a moment nothing happened, just silence pressing in from every direction. until the next pulse came and the key vibrated faintly against the floor, turning ever so slightly in his fingers, as though something beneath was recognizing it, not as an object, but as an answer that had finally arrived. The moment the key shifted in his fingers, Ethan felt something inside the floor respond, not with sound at first, but with a subtle release of pressure, as if a mechanism long held in place had finally loosened its grip, and Ranger immediately stepped back, giving space, his eyes fixed on the exact point where wood met wood. Ethan did not rush, his movements slow and deliberate as he pressed the key more firmly against the surface, turning it instinctively even though there was no visible lock. And then it happened. A faint but unmistakable click echoed from below, followed by a narrow seam forming between the floorboards that had moments ago seemed perfectly solid. The line was thin at first, barely visible in the dim light. But as the next 27 seconds passed and the pulse returned, the seam widened just enough to reveal that the section of floor beneath them was not fixed at all, but a concealed panel crafted with precision far beyond what the rest of the hotel suggested. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath steady, while his mind worked through the implications, because this was not decay, not accident. This was intention, something built to remain hidden until the exact right conditions were met. Ranger moved closer again, lowering his head toward the opening, his nose hovering just above the gap, as if sensing the air rising from below, and Ethan noticed it too now, a faint shift in temperature, cooler, carrying with it a dry metallic scent that did not belong to an abandoned place. The panel did not open fully on its own. It stopped midway, as though waiting, and Ethan understood then that this was only the first step, not the answer. He set the key aside carefully and placed both hands on the edges of the loosened boards, applying steady pressure, testing the weight, and slowly the hidden section gave way, sliding just a few inches more before stopping again, revealing a narrow dark space beneath, no more than a foot deep at first glance, but deep enough to hide something significant. He leaned closer, angling his head to catch what little light filtered in, and there, partially obscured by shadow, he saw it, a second surface below, not wood this time but metal, smooth and intact, with a small recessed slot at its center shaped precisely to fit the brass key now resting beside him. Ethan felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest, the kind that did not need explanation, and Ranger let out a soft, steady breath, his tail low but calm, as if confirming what Ethan already knew. This was not a forgotten space. It was a designed entry, layered, protected, waiting for someone to follow it all the way through. Ethan picked up the key again, turning it once more in his hand, and for a brief moment he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for what lay beyond, because whatever had been hidden here had been hidden with purpose, and once opened, it would not return to silence. The building around him remained still, no wind, no creaking beams, just the quiet presence of something that had already begun to unfold. And as Ethan lowered the key toward the metal slot beneath the floor, he realized that he was no longer searching for a secret. He was being guided directly into it. The brass key slid into the narrow slot with a quiet certainty, as if it had been waiting there for years just to complete that single motion. And the moment Ethan turned it, a deeper sound answered from below, not loud, not sudden, but deliberate, like a sequence beginning exactly where it had once been paused. The metal surface beneath the wooden panel shifted slightly, then stopped, and for a second nothing else happened, leaving only the echo of that movement hanging in the still air, until Ranger stepped forward again and placed his paw gently against the edge of the opening, his ears angled forward in that same focused stillness that had guided them from the start. Ethan watched the dog, then leaned closer, lowering himself enough to see the full shape of what lay beneath. And this time the light revealed more, not just a flat metal plate, but a seam running along its edge, forming a second hidden door beneath the first, designed with precision so clean it almost disappeared. Into the darkness, he pressed his hand against it, feeling the faint vibration return, and as the next 27 seconds passed, the mechanism responded again, this time with a soft release that allowed the metal panel to shift inward, opening just enough to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. A breath of cooler air rose from below, carrying a scent that was not decay, not age, but something preserved, untouched, as though time had been carefully kept outside this hidden space. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before reaching for the flashlight clipped to his pack, switching it on and angling the beam downward, where the steps extended deeper than he expected, disappearing into shadow with a precision that suggested they had been built to last, not to crumble. Ranger moved first, stepping carefully onto the top stair, pausing to look back at Ethan not with hesitation but with quiet insistence, as if to say that whatever lay below was meant to be found. Ethan followed, his boots making soft contact with the metal steps, each one solid, unmoved by the years above, and as he descended, the world of the hotel faded behind him, replaced by a silence that felt different, not empty, but contained. The beam of his flashlight traced the walls as he moved, revealing smooth concrete reinforced with steel supports, a structure that did not belong to a simple building renovation, but to something far more intentional, something built to remain hidden regardless of what happened above. Halfway down, Ethan paused, listening, and the pulse returned again, no longer distant but surrounding him now, steady and close, like a heartbeat within the walls themselves. Ranger stood a few steps below, still and alert, his gaze fixed ahead, where the staircase finally opened into a wider space. And as Ethan reached the bottom, the light revealed a room unlike anything he had expected, not ruined, not forgotten, but preserved with careful precision, shelves lining the walls, sealed containers stacked neatly, and at the center, a large steel case resting on a platform as if it were the reason everything else had been built around it. Ethan stepped forward slowly, the weight of the discovery settling into something deeper than surprise, because this was no accident, no random hidden space. This was a place designed to protect something valuable enough to outlast time itself. And as Ranger moved closer to the case, lowering his head slightly, Ethan understood that they had not just found a secret, they had reached the very thing it was meant to guard. The room held its silence in a way that felt deliberate, not empty but contained, as if every object inside it had been placed with intention and then left undisturbed by time. And Ethan took a slow step forward, his boots echoing softly against the concrete floor while Ranger remained just ahead, his posture steady, alert without tension. The air was cooler here, carrying that same faint metallic scent, but now it was cleaner, like something preserved rather than abandoned. And as Ethan's flashlight moved across the shelves, he began to notice the order of it all. Rows of sealed containers labeled in careful handwriting, dates marked decades apart, each one untouched, each one waiting. He approached the large steel case at the center, drawn not just by its size but by the quiet gravity it seemed to hold. And as he came closer, the steady pulse he had felt above and along the staircase seemed to settle into the room itself, no longer distant or surrounding, but anchored here, as if this was its source. Ranger lowered his head slightly, nose hovering inches from the case, then looked back at Ethan with a calm certainty that needed no explanation. Ethan reached out, placing his hand on the surface, and felt a faint vibration beneath his palm, not mechanical exactly, but rhythmic, consistent, like something alive in its precision. He examined the edges, noting the craftsmanship, the reinforced corners, the sealed lock that did not match the brass key he still held, and for a moment he wondered if this was where the trail ended, not with an opening but with a question. Then his light shifted, catching something just to the side of the case, a narrow table built into the wall, and on it lay a stack of documents bound neatly together, protected under a clear covering that had kept them free from dust and decay. Ethan stepped toward it, lifting the top page carefully, and as his eyes moved across the words, something in his expression changed, not with shock, but with recognition. The names, the locations, the markings, they belonged to a world he had once known too well, a world of operations that were never spoken about outside of those who had lived them. He turned another page, then another, and the pattern became clearer. This was not just storage, not just protection. This was a record, a hidden archive of something that had been deliberately removed from the surface and placed here instead. Behind him, Ranger shifted slightly, his ears tilting as if responding to a subtle change in the room, and Ethan felt it too, the pulse returning, stronger now, almost in response to the fact that he was reading, that he was understanding. He looked back at the steel case, then down at the documents again, and a quiet realization settled in. This place had not been hidden to keep something out. It had been hidden to keep something safe until the right moment, until the right person could find it and know what it meant. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of that thought pressing deeper than the discovery itself, because whatever was inside that case was not just valuable. It was connected, tied to a past that had not disappeared the way he once believed it had. And as he set the documents back down, his hand lingering for a second longer than necessary, he understood that opening the case would not just reveal what had been hidden, it would reveal why it had been waiting for him. The silence in the room deepened as if it were listening to Ethan think, and he stood there with the documents still fresh in his mind, his gaze slowly returning to the steel case at the center, its surface dull but untouched, carrying a presence that felt heavier now that he understood even a fraction of what this place was. Ranger shifted closer, his paws quiet against the floor, and this time he did not simply observe. He circled the case once, slow and deliberate, his nose tracing along the edges before stopping at the front where the lock sat recessed into the metal, and he let out a low, steady breath, not a warning, not hesitation, but recognition. Ethan stepped forward, crouching beside the case, his fingers brushing over the lock, feeling its shape, its design, and realizing quickly that this was no ordinary mechanism. There were no numbers, no visible pins, nothing that matched the key he had used to enter the space, and yet something about it felt familiar, not in form, but in intent. He leaned back slightly, exhaling as he thought, his eyes drifting once more toward the table where the documents rested, and then it came to him, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet connection forming between what he had read and what he now faced. He returned to the table, flipping through the pages again, slower this time, paying attention not just to the words but to the patterns, the symbols, the markings that had seemed insignificant before, and there it was, repeated. In small detail along the margins, a sequence, subtle but consistent, like a code embedded in plain sight. Ethan traced it with his finger, committing it to memory, then stood and turned back to the case, his movements calm, deliberate, guided not by certainty, but by trust in the path that had brought him here. Ranger stepped aside slightly, watching him, giving space again, his ears still forward, his attention unwavering. Ethan placed his hand on the lock and began to move his fingers across its surface, pressing gently in the sequence he had just seen, one point, then another, pausing between each as if waiting for a response. And for a moment nothing happened, the room holding its breath with him, until the faintest sound answered, a soft, internal shift, followed by another as he continued, each press unlocking something unseen within the mechanism. The pulse in the room grew steadier, stronger, aligning with his actions, as if the space itself was acknowledging that he was following the intended path. Then, after the final press, the lock released with a quiet but unmistakable click, and the lid of the case lifted just slightly on its own. No sudden movement, no dramatic reveal, just a gentle release, as if it had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. Ethan did not open it right away, his hand resting on the edge, his breath slow, because he understood now that whatever lay inside was not just hidden wealth or forgotten records. It was something placed here with purpose, something that had survived untouched not by accident, but by design. And as Ranger stepped closer once more, his presence steady at Ethan's side, there was no longer any doubt. This discovery was not random. It was a continuation of something that had begun long before either of them had ever set foot in this place. The lid did not rise all at once. It lifted slowly as if time itself resisted the moment, and Ethan's hand remained steady on the cold metal edge while the narrow gap widened just enough for a breath of air to escape from within, carrying a scent unlike anything above, dry and preserved, like paper and steel sealed away from the years. Ranger stepped closer, his posture calm but intent, eyes fixed on the opening as though he understood that what lay inside was not simply hidden, but guarded by time itself. Ethan finally pushed the lid higher, careful, controlled, and the interior revealed itself piece by piece under the beam of his flashlight. First a layer of neatly arranged documents bound in protective sleeves, then beneath them, rows of compact containers secured with precision, and at the very center, a a smaller case, darker, heavier, marked with a symbol that caught Ethan's breath before he could stop it. He froze, his eyes narrowing slightly as recognition settled in, not loud or sudden, but quiet and undeniable. Because that symbol was not unfamiliar, it belonged to a division he had not spoken about in years, one that did not appear in official records, one that existed in the space between missions and silence. Ranger shifted beside him, letting out a soft breath as if acknowledging the weight of that moment, and Ethan reached inside, lifting the smaller case with both hands, feeling its solid weight, far heavier than its size suggested, as though it carried more than just physical contents. He set it carefully on the floor beside the larger case and opened the latches, each one releasing, with a soft metallic click that echoed gently in the still room. And when the lid lifted, the light revealed what lay inside. Not loose valuables, not scattered wealth, but something far more deliberate. Rows of gold bars stacked with exact alignment, their surfaces untouched, each stamped and dated, accompanied by sealed envelopes tucked precisely between them, each one labeled with names, locations, and dates that stretched back decades. Ethan's breath slowed as he took it in, not because of the value, though he understood immediately what it meant, but because of the structure, the intent, the story it suggested. This was not hidden treasure meant to be forgotten. This was a reserve, a protected legacy, placed here with purpose. He picked up one of the envelopes, turning it in his hand, his thumb brushing over the name written on its surface, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to grow even quieter, as if waiting for him to read it. But he did not open it yet, not immediately, because something deeper held him back, something that told him this discovery was not just about what was inside the case, but about why it had been left here in the first place. Ranger lowered himself beside Ethan, calm now, his presence steady and grounding, and Ethan glanced at him before looking back at the case, the gold, the envelopes, the symbol, all aligning into a single realization that settled slowly into place. This was never meant to be lost. It was meant to be found, but only by someone who would understand what it truly represented. And as his fingers tightened slightly around the envelope, Ethan knew that whatever came next would not just change what he had found, it would change what he believed about the past he thought he had already left behind. The envelope felt heavier than paper should, not in weight, but in meaning, and Ethan turned it slowly between his fingers, his eyes fixed on the name written across its surface, a name he had not seen in years but had never truly forgotten. The room seemed to narrow around that single detail, the shelves, the containers, even the gold fading into the background as something far more personal took hold. Ranger remained still beside him, his breathing slow and steady, as if he understood that this moment did not belong to instinct or discovery, but to memory. Ethan finally slid a finger beneath the seal and opened the envelope with care, unfolding the single sheet inside. And as his eyes moved across the words, the quiet certainty he had been feeling began to take shape into something undeniable. The letter was not long, but it was precise, written in a tone that carried both authority and restraint. And it spoke not of wealth or ownership, but of trust, of contingency, of something set aside in case the world above failed to remember what had been done below. The names listed were not random. They were part of a network, individuals who had contributed, protected, and hidden this reserve, not for themselves, but for a purpose that extended beyond any single life. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly as he read, not from tension, but from recognition, because he understood now that this was not just a hidden fortune, it was a safeguard, a silent agreement preserved in gold and ink. He lowered the paper slowly, his gaze drifting back to the case, to the rows of bars and envelopes, each one representing a piece of that agreement, a fragment of a larger story that had been carefully buried beneath layers of time and distance. Ranger shifted slightly, his ears flicking toward the far wall, as if catching something faint, and Ethan followed the movement with his eyes, noticing for the first time a small panel set into the concrete, nearly invisible unless one was looking for it. He stood, moving toward it with measured steps, the letter still in his hand, and as he approached, the faint pulse that had guided him from the beginning seemed to settle again, softer now, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. The panel bore the same symbol as the case, etched lightly into its surface, and beneath it, a narrow slot that mirrored the one he had seen before. Ethan glanced down at the letter, then back at the panel, and for a moment he hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but because he understood that each step forward revealed not just more of the secret, but more of his place within it. Ranger stepped closer, his presence steady, his gaze calm, and Ethan exhaled slowly before folding the letter and placing it carefully back into the envelope. He did not open the panel yet, not immediately, because something deeper had already begun to unfold within him, something that told him this discovery was not about finding what had been hidden, but about understanding why it had been left for him to find. And as the silence returned to the room, no longer heavy but settled, Ethan realized that the true weight of what lay before him was not measured in gold, but in the quiet responsibility it carried. The quiet in the room no longer felt like something waiting to be broken. It felt like something that had already made its decision, and Ethan stood there with the envelope in his hand, his gaze resting on the small panel set into the concrete wall, the symbol etched into it catching the edge of his light, like a memory refusing to fade. Ranger moved closer to the panel, not hurried, not uncertain, his posture calm and grounded. And when he stopped, he placed his nose just inches from the narrow slot beneath the marking, then looked back at Ethan with that same steady awareness that had guided every step since they entered the building. Ethan walked toward it slowly, each step measured, not because he feared what might happen, but because he understood now that this was not a place meant to be rushed through. Every part of it had been designed to unfold at its own pace, and he had already seen enough to know that nothing here was accidental. He reached the wall and placed his hand against the cool surface, feeling no movement this time, no pulse, just a stillness that felt complete, as if whatever force had guided him here had already done its work. He studied the panel closely, tracing the symbol with his eyes, then lowering his gaze to the slot beneath it, identical in size and shape to the one he had used before, and without hesitation, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key. For a moment he held it there, not moving, his thoughts settling into a quiet clarity, because he understood now that this was not about unlocking something hidden, it was about accepting something that had already been set in motion long before he arrived. Ranger sat beside him, calm, his presence steady and unwavering, and Ethan finally moved, guiding the key into the slot with a controlled, deliberate motion. The moment it slid into place, there was no resistance, no delay, only a soft internal shift, followed by a deeper sound that echoed faintly through the walls, not mechanical, but structured, like a sequence completing itself. Ethan turned the key slowly, and, as he did, the panel responded, not by opening outward, but by retracting inward with a smooth, almost silent motion, revealing a narrow compartment hidden within the wall. Inside, there was no gold, no documents, no containers, only a single object resting at the center, a small recorder, compact and carefully preserved, its surface untouched by dust or time, as if it had been placed there with the expectation that it would one day be used again. Ethan reached in and lifted it gently, feeling its weight, its presence, and something about it felt different from everything else he had found, not because of its value, but because of what it represented. He turned it in his hand, his thumb brushing lightly over the controls, and for a moment he hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but because he understood that whatever was stored inside this device would not just explain the past, it would connect it directly to him. Ranger remained still, watching, his eyes calm, and Ethan exhaled slowly before pressing the button, the quiet click of activation breaking the silence in a way nothing else had. And as the device came to life, a voice began to form from the speaker, low, steady, and unmistakably familiar, carrying with it the weight of something that had been waiting far longer than any of the gold or documents ever could. The voice that emerged from the recorder was not distorted by time. It was clear, steady, and carried a calm authority that settled into the room as if it had always belonged there. And Ethan felt his chest tighten slightly, as recognition came not from the words at first, but from the tone itself, a tone he had heard years ago in moments that required silence, precision, and trust. The voice spoke slowly, as if aware that each word would matter long after it was first recorded, explaining that What had been hidden here was never meant to disappear. It was meant to endure, to remain untouched until someone capable of understanding both its value and its purpose arrived. Ethan stood completely still, the recorder held firmly in his hand, while Ranger sat beside him, calm and attentive, his presence steady as the voice continued. It spoke of a network that had operated quietly, of individuals who had chosen to place resources beyond reach, not for power, not for gain, but as a safeguard, against a future that might forget what integrity required. The gold, the documents, the structure itself, all of it had been part of a contingency, a silent agreement that if the time ever came when trust in systems failed, something would remain, something that could be used to restore balance, not control it. Ethan's eyes drifted slowly across the room as he listened, the shelves, the containers, the case, all aligning now into a single, undeniable truth. This was not hidden wealth waiting to be claimed. It was a responsibility waiting to be accepted. The voice paused briefly, and in that moment of silence, Ethan could hear his own breathing, steady but heavier than before, and then it continued, softer now, more personal, as if the message had shifted from a general instruction to something meant specifically for the one who would hear it. It spoke of the difficulty of recognizing the right person, of the need for both strength and restraint. And then it said something that caused Ethan's grip on the recorder to tighten ever so slightly. It said that the one who found this place would not be chosen by chance, but by the path they had walked, by the decisions they had made when no one was watching. Ranger shifted slightly, pressing closer to Ethan's leg, and the subtle warmth of the dog's presence grounded him as the weight of those words settled deeper. The voice then gave a final instruction, not a command, but a choice, stating that everything within this hidden space could be used, but only if the one who found it understood that its purpose was not to change their life, but to change what their life would stand for. The recording ended without ceremony, the soft click of the device returning the room to silence. But it was no longer the same silence as before. Ethan lowered the recorder slowly, his gaze distant for a moment as he absorbed what he had just heard. And then he looked around the room once more, not as someone discovering something new, but as someone beginning to understand something that had already been waiting for him. Ranger remained at his side, calm and steady, and in that quiet moment, Ethan realized that this was no longer about what he had found beneath the hotel. It was about what he would choose to carry with him when he walked back out into the world above. The silence that followed the voice did not feel empty. It felt settled, as if something that had been waiting for years had finally been said and no longer needed to linger. And Ethan stood there with the recorder still in his hand, his gaze resting on the steel case, the gold, the envelopes, but seeing them differently now, not as objects, but as choices. Ranger remained beside him, calm and grounded, his steady presence anchoring the moment in something real, something simple, and Ethan slowly exhaled, the weight in his chest shifting into something clearer, not lighter, but more defined. He moved toward the case again, kneeling beside it, and this time when he looked at the gold bars, he did not see wealth, he saw time, years of quiet decisions made by people who believed that something worth protecting should not depend on recognition or reward. He reached for one of the envelopes, the same one he had opened before, and held it for a moment longer, his thumb brushing over the name, understanding now that each envelope was not just a record, but a connection, a reminder that this hidden place had been built on trust that extended beyond any single moment. Ranger shifted slightly, his ears flicking toward the staircase behind them, and Ethan followed the movement with his eyes, noticing how the light from above seemed softer now, less distant, as if the path back was no longer something unknown, but something waiting. He closed the smaller case carefully, securing the latches with deliberate precision, not out of fear of losing what was inside, but out of respect for what it represented. And then he stood, holding the recorder loosely at his side, his mind no longer searching for answers, but considering what came next. The room remained still, unchanged, yet everything about it felt different, not because it had revealed its secret, but because he had understood it. Ethan walked slowly toward the shelves, his fingers brushing lightly along the sealed containers, feeling the consistency, the order, the quiet intention behind every detail. And for a moment he allowed himself to imagine the people who had placed these here, The care they had taken, the belief they must have held that one day, someone would find this and know what to do. He stopped near the base of the stairs and turned back one last time, his eyes moving across the room, not memorizing it, but acknowledging it as if, marking the moment in a way that did not require words. Ranger stood beside him, ready, not urging, not pulling, simply present, and Ethan nodded slightly, more to himself than anything else, before beginning the slow climb back up, each step carrying him away from the hidden space and closer to the world above. As he reached the top, the faint light of the lobby returned, pale and quiet, and when his boots touched the wooden floor again, the pulse that had guided him from the beginning was gone, not because it had ended, but because it had already done what it was meant to do, leaving behind not a mystery, but a decision that would follow him long after he stepped outside. The lobby greeted him with a quiet stillness that felt different now, no longer heavy with something hidden, but open in a way it had not been before, and Ethan stood there for a moment, letting the pale light settle around him as Ranger stepped forward onto the worn wooden floor, his posture relaxed at last, the tension that had guided him below now replaced by a calm, steady presence. The rug still lay pushed aside, the hidden panel beneath it partially open, but even that no longer felt like a secret. It felt like a doorway that had already served its purpose. Ethan walked slowly across the room, his boots echoing softly as he took in the details again. The draped furniture, the dust caught in the morning light, the quiet lines of a place that had been waiting not for repair, but for recognition. He moved toward the front windows, brushing aside a thin layer of dust with his hand, and outside. The valley stretched wide and still beneath the sky, untouched by the discovery that had just taken place beneath his feet, and yet somehow, everything felt different. Ranger joined him at the window, sitting beside him, his gaze moving across the landscape, as if confirming that what mattered most was not what they had found below, but what lay ahead. Ethan reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the brass key and the recorder, both now silent, both now part of something that no longer needed to guide him step by step. He looked down at Ranger, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corner of his mouth, and the dog returned the glance with that same quiet awareness that had carried them through every moment since they arrived. There was no urgency now, no hidden signal waiting to be followed, only a stillness that allowed him to think clearly for the first time in a long while. He turned away from the window and walked back toward the center of the lobby, stopping just short of the open panel, his eyes lowering to it briefly, not with hesitation, but with understanding. He knelt and carefully pulled the wooden section back into place, aligning it with the surrounding floor until the seam nearly disappeared, then slid the rug back over it, restoring the surface to what it had been before, not to hide it again, but to protect it, to leave it as it had been left for him. Ranger watched quietly, then stood and moved toward the door, pausing just long enough to look back once more, as if asking a simple question that needed no words. Ethan nodded slightly and followed, pushing the door open and stepping out into the cool air, where the wind moved freely, carrying the scent of pine and distance, a sharp contrast to the contained silence below. He paused on the threshold, looking back once, not at the building, but at the moment itself, the choice that now rested with him. And then he stepped forward, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, Ranger moving at his side, both of them leaving the hotel behind, not because it no longer mattered, but because what they carried from it would shape everything that came next. And somewhere beneath the quiet structure, unseen and untouched, the truth remained exactly where it was meant to be, waiting not to be found again, but to be honored in the life that continued beyond it.